and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Competition between the United States and China is heating up. The U.S. plans to bolster spending on research and development in technology and innovation. The Endless Frontier Act, first introduced last year, would invest $100 billion in science and education over a 5-year period. Washington wants to focus on areas such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, biotechnology, and cybersecurity. The bill enjoys bipartisan support and passed the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on May the 12th. It now awaits approval by the Senate. Experts describe it as a way for the U.S. to strengthen its security and compete with China. Really? Could it lead to fierce technology rivalry between China and the United States? Let's loop in our panelists from both countries. For the discussion on Endless Frontier Act in New York, Max Wolf, CEO of Systematic Ventures and Professor of Economics from the New School University. In Beijing, Gai Keke, Associate Professor from the School of Computer Science and Technology with Beijing Institute of Technology. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. For the Endless Frontier Act, I want to have your input. $110 billion likely to put into basic science and technological research. That is according to the Senate vote of this act. Professor Wolf, how far do you think this act will help the United States be able to achieve its next stage of scientific and technological research?
Look, I think we're still kind of waiting to see how this works out because it's not a completely finished product here. But I think having a national industrial policy like we once did and like most of the world does makes sense. I think trying to promote key industries, most countries are doing it. I think it makes sense. I think in some ways, although probably most of the politicians wouldn't like this too much, we're kind of copying some successes we've seen from China in terms of framing these national agendas. And I think it's a good idea for the United States to figure out what the most important industries are and make sure that they're getting attention and funding. Some of the language and conversation, I think, is needlessly confrontational, but I guess that's how things get politically done.
But the nature of this is very interesting. It's more about the U.S. be able to gain back what they consider has lost over the years about its support to science and technological research with the rhetorical approach of, against China, or this is mainly, from your perspective, a bill that is likely to be countering China as the sole purpose. Those are very different, I would assume.
For sure. Look, I think the rhetoric and what gets the political capital is more about countering China. And the reality is part of what we've seen the last few years around the world and in the United States is some of the difficulties with supply chain disruptions around the coronavirus, but some other issues, and the loss of some of our manufacturing base has become both a political issue and to some extent a national security and economic issue. Certainly, we have probably gone further than made sense in outsourcing production, but that's very much a global story. It's not a US-China story. And the other part of the story is just that production is global, whether it's done in the United States or elsewhere. So it's not a sort of America versus Russia type scenario or America versus China. That's that old-fashioned political language, and maybe it still gets votes, but it pretty massively fails to understand the realities of a modern globalized economy.
Everything has been hyper politicized, one would say, in Washington, D.C., particularly when it comes to its relations with anything about China or related to China. Therefore, I want to ask you, Associate Professor Gai Keke, from your perspective as a Chinese scientist, how do you see the nature of this Endless Frontier Act that is ongoing in the legislative process in the U.S.?
Like, principally speaking, whether or not the act is passed, I believe it follows the demands of the United States. I don't think we should have any overreaction on it because like each country has its own R&D strategies. So therefore, I guess we just need to do our own work at our own pace.
What is China's work? What is China's pace? Let's just talk about the real nature of China's science and technological research and methods and the overall blueprint China is trying to achieve? Mr. Guy.
Well, from the perspective of the computer science, I think we are making a plan for next 5 years. The 14-5 plan. Well, at this point, I think we are trying to develop our own advantages. For example, nowadays China has advantages in AI industries like natural language processing and computer vision, as well as the UAVs and the robots. So therefore, I think at the one hand, we want to have more advantages in those fields, and on the other hand, we are trying to explore some areas that we don't have the core technologies. For example, the chip industry. Actually, our country, like China, the Chinese government, has a lot of benefit policies to encourage research organizations and enterprises to have some novel work, to have some cut-edge work on those fields.
It's very interesting. If we could use that as an example for both of you gentlemen. AI is being considered as the infrastructure of today and the future. It's nothing mysterious about everything related to the latest development could be, related to AI or even included within the so-called artificial intelligence, ranging from algorithm to a lot of different areas. So if it is the infrastructure, how are we going to see the US and China be able to develop its own, shall we say, backyard of artificial intelligence? To me, that's a very interesting question and a mystery too. Professor Wolf, do you think Washington and other communities have figured out this, the decoupling, really?
Yeah, I don't think it's been all that well figured out. I mean, I do think the world just learned a lesson too, which is we mostly have shared problems, even if we have two different flags. And if we can work together on shared problems, we can cover a lot more scientific ground faster. Now, everything won't be equal, and we do have interests that are not identical, right, in the real world, but they're not that large, right? So I do think that we will do more and get further as humans and as advanced economies and as the two big economies in the world for the foreseeable future if we can do a lot of things together. That being said, artificial intelligence has a political as well as a military as well as an economic component. We are going to see an impact in basic human thought work, like what the Industrial Revolution did for human physical work. Mechanization changed the relationship between human bodies and production, and artificial intelligence in the next 20 years will change the relationship between human thought and production outputs. So it's going to be pretty big. And if you're on the wrong side of this evolution, you could have a competitive disadvantage of epic proportion. That's true. On the flip side, most of the problems we're trying to solve are similar. And we know we're going to need new chips, new batteries, and new electric generation and storage to do it. And it's simply a bigger job than either country could or will do alone.
Right. I don't want to talk about the rhetorical correctness, which I'm sure everybody knows. When the world is united, there seems to be more wisdom and creativity. Putting that aside, let's just assume there's going to be decouple. But then what can be done? What will be done to decouple, first of all, and be able to focus on our own systems? For example, China vis-a-vis US, be able to achieve much in terms of artificial intelligence. So let's play this quote in which Professor John Hopcroft, a Turing Award winner, talking about algorithm and how much he, as a scientist, a pioneering scientist, who didn't know about the future of algorithm, just to use as an example about the overall artificial intelligence. Take a look. What is likely to be the factors that's likely to drive AI development for the future?
We really don't know. I've got to tell you that the world is changing at a rate that I can't really grasp what the future is going to be. I mean, I think some of the key questions to ask are...
What are the key questions?
One of them would be, what percentage of the population is going to be needed to produce all the goods and services we need? And a lot of people conjecture it's going to be less than 25%. And if that's true, how are nations going to make sure that everybody has a standard of living? The other thing is, even if you're paying people, you don't want 75% of your population sitting around doing nothing. So how do you engage them in meaningful activity? These are questions that we're going to have to seriously consider.
Do you have some answers to a certain extent?
Not really.
So that's Professor John Hopcroft. One could consider one of the top minds of the world when it comes to computation science and also algorithm and AI. So even him would not be able to figure out what the future is likely to be. So may I ask you, Mr. Guy, if China and the United States really decoupled with one another, let's just say in AI, how would the two sides be able to approach the future?
I want to talk like 2 points. First, we need more application scenarios because in China, we usually emphasize the technology itself, but we actually need more work on combining or using technology in a correct scenarios. Because like in the States, actually the United States companies usually emphasize the industry itself. We are talking about the industrial internet. That means the internet should serve for the industry. So the technology needs to be used for supporting the industry. It's not like, because for the older generation, we emphasize the internet. The users on the internet are the important one. But in the future, the internet is one of the infrastructure of the industry. So that's why we're talking about the like blockchain as an infrastructure for the future network industry. So that's the first part. The other part is that we need to combine the AI technologies with other advanced technologies. For example, the cloud computing, blockchain, and even quantum computing, because it's about the future technologies. Nowadays, actually, we do have very good market for the cloud computing, and we do have very good foundation for blockchain. But the competition between like different technologies is still at the very beginning stage. We need a lot of work to improve those aspects.
But with government support, top-down approach, will that work to the scenarios, to the two future directions you just said?
We do have some method, actually. Our government encourage the scholars, I mean the professors, to visit in the process to find out the connections between the pure research and the applications of industrial products. In fact, in the past, we actually have very rare attempts on this, but nowadays we are encouraged to find out the connection or bridge up the research achievements with the products, especially for the digital products.
Professor Wolf, what do you think are some of the specific technological directions that the U.S. would like to approach and focus its resources on in this regard? Same question, but a different perspective from the U.S.
Sure. So I sit on the board of a few of the incubator and accelerators here, and we write AI. So internally, we do machine learning and AI. So sometimes I see it. I mean, I think I know what the United States is going to focus on broadly. And I think that a lot of Chinese interest in similar space, where some of the competition comes from, but sensor fusion and the Internet of Things, to have smart sensor chips, that's part of the reason that there's such an interest in all kinds of new chip technology, including affordable chips that don't drink a lot of electricity, that can send out and then process signal so that you can kind of have awareness of machinery and supply levels and inventory and how things are functioning.
Yeah.
That's the future of the automobile and the city. So that's a really big deal, Internet of Things. All the quantum computing, because it's really important to national security, and the cryptography, then obviously the computerized vision to replace human senses at scale, very, very rapidly at scale. I think that's going to be very, very important to a lot of people. We kind of know that. And then deep learning neural networks, both to monitor and also to constantly do recommendation engines at parsing. So to constantly upgrade and feedback information on how things are going. And if, the last generation of this was just to tally information and give it to humans to make decisions, the next generation is to have algorithms make those decisions
Right.
on much more information, much faster than humans can function.
Then how? It is being believed that the U.S. used to have a bottom-up approach, right? Which is, grassroots, industry investing and entrepreneurs investing and capitalists investing. But now with more seems to be support coming from the federal level, at least going to National Science Foundation, are things likely to change? In other words, in the governance of scientific and technological research, is it likely to be turned in a very different way?
I think we're going to see more of a kind of coming together of government, industry, and academia in the United States, which have tended to kind of be in their own space and have communication and coordination problems that were sometimes pretty significant. And I think part of what's happened to the U.S. decision making is there was a probably somewhat arrogant idea that we would always have more investment dollars chasing lots of smart people at the top universities. I think that advantage has shrunk a little bit. I think in the last year or two, you've seen more long-term minded hardware and AI investment dollars actually going into Chinese early stage investment than into the US, where there tends to be a little bit of a more aggressive short-term business to consumer profit motivated investment. And so I think that's made some of the US authorities concerned to get the government, academia, and the private sector more coordinated than we've historically been. And you can just sort of see that here now. That's part of what this bill tries to do, to put money into harmonizing what's being done abstractly in academia and make sure that it has rapid commercialization, or to focus on the areas that have more rapid commercial applicability just to be competitive. And again, I don't think it's just with China. I think it's very global. I think it's South Korea, I think it's Japan, I think it's France, and I think it's Germany. I do think it's more than just sort of US and China.
Very interesting. But the question really is that money sufficient enough to be able to let the government have a bigger say about what to do in terms of direction? If you look at the overall investment in the US or coming from the US in artificial intelligence, it seems private sector, individual investors, entrepreneurs, and academia, they've already have their very clear turfs. So will the government have much say as a result of $110 billion, or maybe more related to this? Professor Wolf.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be less. Looks like it's getting pruned a little bit. Just to give you an idea, I mean, in the scope of the money being thrown around in American venture, this isn't that large. It's also a 5-year budget, so it's really more like 20% of that per year, whatever that turns out to be. And then a lot of it is a large investment in the National Science Foundation to kind of rework that. And there's robotics, there's manufacturing, there's academics, there's commercialization. So in terms of the total size of money kind of in American innovation and technology, it's not that large. It could have a large impact, but it's not that large. I think there's might be more symbolic change here than real, which is getting the government in a coordinating role in the sector and getting everyone culturally comfortable with the notion that that's what America needs to do to be competitive now. I think that might be the bigger story, but the symbolism here is going to be larger than the macroeconomic impact, at least for the first several years.
Now, of course, we know that this act has been updated to so-called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that is even bigger, with bigger areas of contents, but that will still in the legislative process. Having said that, though, there's one crucial question before we go. What about the role of politics and the geopolitics played in terms of encouraging or discouraging scientific and technological advances in our world today. We see some earlier examples. During the Second World War, there were competitions, and nuclear technology was an obvious result of that. Many still remember the nuclear bombs and how decisive it was in terms of creating a strategic advantage for the United States and others to get the Second World War nailed down. Now, later there was a Cold War, U.S. and the former Soviet Union competing, space war and many other areas. Some suggest it has managed to put human beings onto the moon. But others argue differently, saying, will this really help? Actually, it's distracting people, and it's also distracting resources to maybe some of the other directions. So that would bring even more benefits to the human being as a whole. These are two arguments. How do you see as scientists and as investors? Professor Wolf.
Yes, look, I think we're unambiguously better off working together here. I'm not sure we can work apart, but I would answer your good question with another point here, which people who get excited about the us versus them tend to forget. If we do embark on a different course, the Chinese course and the American course, if you will, then if one of us stumbles, they'll fall catastrophically behind. Whereas if we work together with small advantages and disadvantages and gaps, we'll end up more or less in the same place, which is better for humanity. It's also better for political stability. The other thing I'll tell you is we kind of have both case studies in the last year, I think. We can look to those. So we had international cooperation on the COVID medical response, sequenced by the Chinese scientists who gave the world a crucial head start and worked on by both Chinese and American pharmaceutical companies. That is to help humanity, because humanity gets COVID virus. I think in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to have issues of climate, issues of global political stability, and issues of climate refugee and food insecurity that will give us the chance to come together as humans and conquer those, or to fall apart as various groups trying to score points at each other's expense. I think what ties us together is much greater than what separates us. And I would hope, for the sake of humanity, as well as for the United States and for people, whatever flag they're under, that we can work together, because I think the challenges will demand nothing less.
I see. Professor Guy from China.
Oh, I think a Cold War thinking is an old thinking. We need to have like postmodern thinking on the technology. Like for me, I want to talk about the technology, because developing technology is always a key. Nowadays, China also has like a moon projects. Now we have a Mars project. Developing such like high level advanced technology actually will bring a lot of benefits to individual lives. For example, we know Tesla is also building up the space network. So the technology used by the space network will be used for the next generation of the network. During the process of like different projects, the Moon or Mars projects, we actually solve a lot of problems for the next generation of the network. So it happens to a lot of like different technical domains. So that's why we need to have like different advanced projects.
Very interesting. To me, it's a resourceful conversation. I want to thank both of you, Max Wolf and Guy Keke, for joining us. Thank you so much.